straight in. We've had 3 sessions. The first's been on that turning it around, the joy of turning it around. The only way up is down. We've had the session which is more Catholic in spectrum, about seeing the joy of God in things, the joy in looking. And I said to you that was something that was particularly dear to my heart, since I'm working on a research in that area. Because I think a lot of us culturally are not really using our eyes or our imaginations in the way that God has deemed them. The third last week was on the ecstatic relationships of the Holy Spirit. We had, I think, quite a profound group discussion last week. I was quite intrigued to hear where that went. So this week I wanted to talk about the joy in accompaniment. And I've called it angels and demons, but you might replace the word angels for mentors, friends, spiritual directors, people who accompany us on the way, walking with the wise. Our mentors can be like angels. The old word for angel is someone who brings good news, helps us to see things from a great standing, set us free, release us from our sins, unbind us, be the great companions on the road. I can't understate this, actually. Find a wise person, guard and cherish them with your life. One of the things that Francis and I have theologically in common is this experience of being guided by some of the saintliest people, particularly in our 20s, and we seem to stumble serendipitously into meeting the great and the good. And we often talk about that as a real shared privilege. Frances has a picture on the fridge of somebody who was her lecturer in Oxford, who'd been a theologian at what's called the Second Vatican Council, which is the great reforming gathering in the 1960s of the Roman Catholic Church. And each bishop had a theologian come with them. And it was a 3-year process, and it was produced an enormous amount of fruit, which changed the whole church. Ecumenical, it changed the Church of England, it changed the Roman Catholic Church, changed the Lutheran Church, it changed the Methodist Church. And she had a lecturer who was a bishop's advisor to that, and she said he was a man aglow with the Spirit. And so we've got this picture on the fridge of, I forgot to bring, of them arm in arm, and she said he was like a wonderful, wise old granddad, oozing saintliness. I myself came to meet a series of mentors quite early on. The first is a Dartmoor cleric, was Father Douglas. He was a sort of cassocked, cigar-smoking former actor, priest, who held himself aloof, a bit like Rex Harrison. In fact, I used to imagine when I go for confirmation lessons that he would suddenly start singing lines from Pygmalion. And he had a sort of presence and charisma that was, again, like Rex Harrison or Laurence Olivier. It was never overstated. There was never a raising of the voice, but every word carried weight, and it was sort of delicious to hear that. And the sermons that were delivered from the pulpit were carefully crafted, somewhat prosaic, but nevertheless delivered in a way that was spellbinding. He helped me in my latter teens, put my life back together, and later on in my 20s became a spiritual director, to the point where he said I was uneducated in the places of the world, and so in summer holidays he would take me to some of the great pilgrimage sites. We went to see Rome, Assisi, Czestochowa. We went to see the Holy Land, and so on. And it was fantastic. I think also of Brother Ramon, the Franciscan priest, who in his latter years was on the television and is author of many books, a convert to Anglicanism from the Welsh chapels. He was someone who retained the fire of the Baptist preacher, but had the great devotion to St. Francis and the sacraments. I only met him a few times, but they were at periods of intense retreat where I went into this monastery in Worcester, literally in the middle of nowhere, a killer for any car. And I have a picture of him, because at the time I was a bit of a keen photographer, and I have a picture of him writing one of his books on one of those old typewriters, banging away in his monastic habit. On one particular occasion, I asked him why he had announced that he was planning to go off and do a period of retreat for I think it was 6 months or so. He was going off into a hermitage where he'd live in a caravan at the edge of some remote convent. And I said to him, this feels a bit pointless. You could be doing so many other useful things with your life, like working in soup kitchens or preaching, or why are you just going to be sat in a caravan? And he said to me, he said, look, boy, what I'm doing is like doing research into God. Imagine a PhD student. They have to go away and think, and I'm doing research into God. And I kind of got it at that moment. It clicked that this was an investment of time that was going to be hard work, heavy, and needed, and was a gift to the wider church. And from that moment, I began to see that these places of contemplation, these monasteries, were like power grids in the global church. That they were places where the things of God were learnt very, very deeply. And they were places to go for renewal and insight into yourself and in the ways of the world and of the psyche. There were places to go where you could be told, as if putting a mirror up to you, don't kid yourself. It was a place for home truths. And I saw that when I went repeatedly to that place and others, where monks would be quite good at gently taking people apart, including myself. Other stories I don't want to kind of bore you with, but I just want to say, underline, find a wise one, guard and cherish them with your life. There is great joy in accompaniment. And for instance, in this diocese, if you want to take that to a particular formal level, there are people who are trained to give what's called spiritual direction, which is not psychotherapy, though it may border on some elements of therapy. It is a kind of deep spiritual listening and guiding. And the clergy are invited to generally do this as good practice. So I tend to go at the least every 2 months. I try to go every 6 weeks. I find if I don't go, I start to get itchy. I'm like a lightning rod that needs to sort of earth, and when I go to this person up in Exeter for a couple hours, I can just release it all, and then they mostly say little, smile often, occasionally raise an eyebrow, and are usually gentler with me than I would be with myself, a lesson I still find hard. The spiritual world is not a Disneyland. Indeed, all the religions, I think, agree on that one fact. And it's a hard fact for us as consumers in the Western world. The spirit world, the spiritual world, is not a Disneyland. There are dark places the deeper we go. All religious traditions are cautious and suggest the further you go in, the greater your need for accompaniment. Indeed, C.S. Lewis who was a Northern Ireland Anglican, who in many ways had come from the most Protestant of backgrounds, got to that point of knowledge that he went both for spiritual direction extremely regularly to an Anglican nun, and he went weekly to confession. That was not because he was trying to be super pious, but he knew that if he was going to advise others on such a scale, he needed to be advised himself. And you know that if you're a counsellor or a therapist, you have to go through that process yourself. You have to be in therapy to give therapy. And I suppose this is why I'm somewhat shy of the kind of what I might call Mac mindfulness. And I notice some Buddhists are as well. That there is nothing wrong in a sense with taking times of stillness and quietness and meditation. But we have to know that the deeper we go in, it ain't all honey and spice out there. However you interpret that, whether you just say, well, that it's deep and dark memories, or it's malign thoughts with myself, or it's something truly exterior. Thousands of years of writing tell us that dig deep enough and we'll confront some uncomfortable truths. Indeed, there's something to be said that in doing good, the nearer we come to God, the more often we feel resistance. And Jesus says that in his own parables. You can think of the parable of the sower, for instance. That the nearer we come to sheer holiness, more often we get resistance. And some of that may be subtle. Some of it may not be subtle. We might find, for instance, even kind of what we might call physical attacks, that in attempting to do something extremely good and noble, that suddenly a lot of bad things seem to kind of stack up against us. And perhaps we could say that this is validation that we're on the right journey. That if we're doing the godly thing, then we should experience some sort of counter-resistance. If you experience no resistance, perhaps you're off the track. And I can remember one particular parishioner, not here tonight, who said in true style, quoting the scriptures, "Beware when everybody speaks well of you." Maybe you're doing something wrong. I thought, well, that was wise words indeed. Now, as I mentioned at the first talk, Dante, in this respect, again, is a fantastic read. And I know he's hard to read in many ways because we're reading medieval Italian that's been translated and lots of Italian celebrities that he's consigned to various levels of hell. But even if you can get a sense of it, then it's worth kind of digesting. And Dante has the ancient philosopher Virgil, to which apparently he did a lot of study about. And he was, as I'm a bit of a C.S. Lewis fan, he was a Virgil the philosopher fan. So in his descent into hell, it's Virgil who accompanies him. Another good take, actually, an interpretation of this is C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, or the bus trip from hell to heaven. It's brilliant stuff. I'll come back to it in a minute. But Dante finds himself in midlife in a dark forest, and when he gets to the gates of hell, there's a sign saying, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter." It's brilliant stuff. And he, of course, like any of us, says, "Well, I don't think I'll do this one today." And Virgil says, "In you go." And often at various levels, Virgil is, taking him to the point where they are climbing the back of Satan, who's munching away at, if I remember right, it's Judas and Brutus, isn't it? The two great betrayers of what he saw as civilization, and to get through to purgatory. And Virgil's kind of ushering him on. And I think one of the highlights of the whole Divine Comedy is the arrival in paradise. And you might think when they get to paradise, well, that's it. That's great. I'm here, put my bags down, I've done my bit. Great. And Virgil says, no, there's more work to be done. As he's wandering around the a sort of Garden of Eden place, which when I read it felt a bit like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, that first scene, where Augustus Gloop goes up the chute. It's got edible grass, it's got chocolate edible grass, and everything looks lovely and everybody looks fantastic, and you think, oh, this is great. And there's a firewall. I think it's where we get the expression firewall. There's a firewall, and I'm paraphrasing this, obviously. And Dante's sort of like, what's that? And Virgil says, you know that girl you really fancied, and you've been going on and on in your head for most of your adult life. And her name was Beatrice. He only ever met her twice. Apparently, both times she scolded him, and the second time it was quite a very short-lived conversation. But he completely blew up this fantasy in his head about her. She died, I think, in her mid-20s in childbirth, all very tragic. There was no relationship. It was just a purely kind of thing that this ideal person, this ideal woman, Beatrice, consumed him. And he said, she's on the other side of that. And so Virgil pushes him to sort of say, well, if you put your hand through, you walk through the firewall, you'll see Beatrice. She's there waiting for you. And of course, as he goes through it, it's excruciating, because he is being decimated. The last vestiges of his ego are being kind of pulled apart. It's a spiritual freedom. He's going to get his wings, but at what cost? When he could just stay in the nice Willy Wonka Eden bit, and eat chocolate grass. So he goes through and he's screaming about how it hurts, and Virgil's egging him on and says, I'm not going to go through with you. But she's going to be your guide for heaven. And when he falls into this next level of paradise, he sees her, and she is more beautiful than any fantasy that he ever had, to the extent that he is ashamed of his fantasy, and he cannot look at her to begin with, because she is so pure, so stunning, so Christ-like. And he realizes that the image that he had of her was so shallow, that he has shamed himself, and he's a grovelling wreck on the floor, and she's able to pick him up and take him to be the guide for the next stages, So in all of this, again, I'm just wanting to underline that sense of find the wise one, guard and cherish them with your life. If you want a good read into the spiritual battle, because I'm also wanting to talk about the demons in a sense, I still would say the best read, and you don't even have to read it because there are some fantastic audio books done on this. The best read is the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. You will roar with laughter. And I think there was a new version of it done a couple of years ago that you can get on the Beeb, and it's probably a couple hours. It is hilarious. And Lewis, you realise, is the sort of Oxford Don who's actually so much more worldly than you think, and probably sat in the laundrette just people watching and observing how people ticked, and knowing himself, being very true to himself and his own dark sense as well. So the Screwtape Letters is a dialogue between two demons, a major and a minor, and hell is essentially portrayed, and this was very much the C.S. Lewis thing, as a sort of Orwellian bureaucracy, carpeted. I think he imagines this sort of very, sort of like one of these sort of American offices that goes on and on forever, with little cubby holes, and so that there's wormwood and screw tape. See, I'm losing it. Wormwood and screw tape communicating to each other. It's their correspondence to try and divert this new Christian away from having any serious faith at all. What they want him to have is a sort of one-dimensional Christianity that does just the basics, and it doesn't go into any, for goodness sake, don't let him go into any depth. So, and it's wonderful because it talks about, that God is called the enemy, and then Satan is called our Father down below, and he just kind of gets into those places as in psychology that is awesome in terms of insight, and there's a lesson in every page, and it's dripping with meaning and humour throughout. I think it's one of his best writings. I really would recommend it. It's a couple hours read or listen, and you'll be chuckling away, particularly when the junior demon gets it wrong every now and again, and you hear the uncle-like demon sort of choking almost in his writing, and it's sort of so. I think in this way Lewis is telling us something that's so very, very significant, and in many ways is at odds with a lot of common thinking, but particularly. And I don't want to sort of do down therapists and counselling, but that there is a take in some therapy which says that the person coming to therapy can never be told that they've done anything wrong, and perhaps what we need from time to time is for someone to sort of say, "Really, you did that?" to get us to sit up and to look at ourselves afresh. Do you remember that home truth I said from St. Teresa of Avila, who said that I am a worm, but But this worm is going to become a butterfly. The two halves of Christian redemption, that we begin acknowledging our inability to get anything right so often, but the grace of God to give us wings. Oh, by the way, Teresa of Avila was very canny on spiritual direction. She said she would choose any time a wise priest over a pious one. I can't quite exactly explain what that means, but I know in my gut what she means.
So arrogant that you're no earthly good.
Good. Well,
not truly pious at all. Just making it look as if you are.
In the old world, in the medieval model that Lewis so liked, man is not, though the world is in the centre of the universe, the ego is not. The ego is at the rim. And we're expected to be connected to everything. We're invited to live a kind of cathedral-like life, where we go in and we're lifted up, where we're experiencing the transcendent. The danger of modern life, as I've mentioned before, is like that girl, do you remember in that first video clip I showed, who's walking with her smartphone and then walks into the water fountain in the shopping mall because she's there, and then tries to get up and carry on walking as if nothing's happened, but CCTV is going to make her a famous YouTube sensation. That is a parable of where we could end up, where we are so curled up within ourselves and our own needs and desires and narcissism that we can't see anything beyond that. And so our guides, our mentors, our accompaniers are those who can give us wider horizons. And in the Bible, for instance, some of the greatest have found that a trial too. They've been able to speak great truths about themselves and their own failures. St. Paul in the 7th chapter of Romans speaks about that and how he wants to do good, but there's this side to him that pulls him away from that. And he thanks God for the grace of God, for that amazing grace that can love him and save him anyway. But he says his natural inclination is to veer off the road. If you're driving a car, it's very hard, isn't it? If you take your hand off the steering wheel on the dual carriageway and you notice after a while the car naturally veers one way or another because our tyres aren't perfect. Right? They're never perfectly aligned, and the roads are imperfect, so we tend to go off. And we don't feel it at first, but it's nevertheless happening. So much of what we have at the moment in terms of consumerism is fueled by what I call a kind of Freudian narcissism. This is, well, to put it in sales speak, what we are told to tell ourselves is the customer is always right. I am always right. And if we're not right, then it must be because somebody else is making it wrong for us. That we are, in a sense, being oppressed by others. And I think that's why we're very shy of institutions. In a way that our forebears weren't. Now, I'm not saying this is right, but I can remember reading somewhere that at the beginning of the First World War, from that pulpit over there, that the vicar said, the verger and I will be collecting names for boys and men who want to go to war. And they had no problems in getting volunteers. I'm not necessarily saying that was right, because the First World War is highly complicated. But the general disposition was to think duty first, yourself second. And consumerism turns that inside out. We are told that if we don't purchase this or that, then somehow we're failing, or we're less than what we could be. Go on, have it because you deserve it is probably the big advertising billboard thing, isn't it? Even if it's not said in the actual words. But however, when we ring sales, someone always picks up. I found that if I've got a product that's faulty, I ring sales. I always get someone chirpy. If you ring customer services, well, your call is in a queue. Your call is important to us. After 20 minutes, we know that our call doesn't matter a damn, does it, really? We begin to feel that as if that company has conned us. Maybe the whole world has conned us. We are oppressed. Of course.
Who wants to go back to 1912?
Yes and no. Yes. I think what I want to say, and we'll have a group discussion in a minute about that, is that we need mentors and angels to put us in the right frame of mind, to give us a perspective. And I think with 1912, there is a balance to be held between duty and also human carnage.
I wasn't only thinking of war. I was thinking of who wants to go back to 1900, for example, when there wasn't enough electricity, and that I would probably, born in this role of life into which I was born, have not had access to higher education, and lots of things which have been great would not have been possible for lots of people. I'm not saying I disagree with you, but much of what technology has delivered and social advance has delivered has been fantastic, but much hasn't.
Yes. I think it's how we navigate that, particularly as Christian people, in a way that's engaging and intelligent, that takes the things of the past that are good and the things of the present that are good, and gets that right. And in all of this, find a joy in that. Find a joy in other people's wisdom, in other people's experience, so that we can grow and flourish. I think what's surprising is how few know that or go through life not knowing that. And I suppose personally, I felt ever so blessed to know some of these holy people over the years, and I'd love others to know that. I think I may have mentioned in another sermon that when I went, Brother Ramon died in 2000, but I was also given a lot of spiritual accompaniment by Brother Raymond, who's from Northern Ireland and is now at the Hillfield community. And it was lovely that he came to see me for spiritual instruction, which I felt like that, that someone so experienced had come to a priest just on retreat. And though we'd been sort of pen pals for a number of years, we'd sort of forgotten the relationship had sort of died with the passing of time. But there's a real joy in this, and that I think that there's a danger that so many people are missing out in finding that important balance. Yes, I'm not saying that the modern life is all bad in any ways, but it has some psychological issues that for the future we need a sort of banks of wisdom to kind of allow us to continue to progress, and maybe some senses of duty weren't. There were some things in the past that were good and healthy. There were many things that were toxic and horrible, Anyway, I'm going to pause, and we're going to give these guys some work to do and tea and coffee, and then I've got a second talk which we're going to look at the accompaniment of the whole church, being part of church, and why church is not some sort of holy club, but is a real special society for us to belong to.